Northside, pulling up in the H. Where you at? I'm in the city, it's gates. The fighting shop, I need to get in your face. 500 blocks in the middle, be getting ridiculous. A lot of this shit wasn't straight. I dropped the load on my partner and called some problem, receiving a lot of complaints. And doing this posted, jump out the gym in the kitchen. The smokers not liking the taste. Dropping the cocoa, vanilla, extracting the pirates and trying not to run them away. Big homie and boss, I'm say to this woman, I'm tempted to go back and forth with the phone. Wait on my killers to get out of prison in case these niggas don't play by the rules. I can remember when I was just watching the 36 flipper, we stood on the block, grabbing it hard out the bar, those stains on my underclothes, they been breaking the racks. Surrounded by judges, I keep in my company, need them a wake up, I give them a die. Back on my ears in the kitchen, we standing and I'm in here practicing over a pie. Yeah, love. Make sure you shake that box up real good and ain't no clumps in it, cause you might be about to take it back when you got it. They hate the salute when you stand up. Dude back there on the canopy grabbing a They come up, then you can tan up. They come up, then you can tan up. Bitch, you think we gon' come down there and tell bedroom on the one and I'm 2500 the self in the H to the quinine. I spray with the shit and I dry it out. You know how I maneuver with that on the roller, pull up to the shoulder and try it out. You know I'm that crush, she nine out. I cut the end to the draw when Obama had won the election. I'm running for president. Look, got a text went up on the number, but I made my money from fucking with guns. Got me a doctor, my wife on the OD on oxys. He showed me the room with the rocks. He know I'm Julio, them blood society. Half of them don't even know how I'm rocking. We stand on that business, they know we about action, but niggas be taking our name and they drag. Fuck, applying that pressure, I hit with the press, and a lot of you won't understand. Then go to talk over slick so the charters don't stick, but I'm in this bitch changing on pound for more than I had what I mixed. Another two on the split, put the bitch in the jackery stand. I'ma just let the decision check the watch with the tick. Kiss on a bitch for the back of her pants. I got that dope and they know that I'm swagging. I chill on the boat when I go to my head. I'm in Dubai, it ain't funny now. I get them for 26, 532 on the fly. I might drop on the 29. Yeah, play with the kid in the car shoe. I might can't move with the car dude. I'm on that money, man. Had to work out in the gym. At first I was fat, now I'm getting real slim. I'm slipping, I'm drill like a bicycle rim. Bitch on my dick and shit, what it is. They hate the salute when you stand up. Why is that? They hate the salute when you stand up. They come on and you can stand up. They come on and you can stand up. They come on and you can stand up. They hate the salute when you stand up. Doing your best. They hate the salute when you stand up. Keep doing your best. They hate the salute when you stand up. I ain't never stop grinding, girl. Realize on the road, I've been played, been betrayed, and taken toll on. Some stay the same, most change, others fall on. I'ma give a heart bigger, and it be a little different. I'm forgiving, don't forget it. Right game, wrong it. Say right game, wrong it. Say right game, wrong it. Yeah, say a talk.
Yeah, man. That's the message for today, man. Right game, wrong nigga.
Here are the top search results.
I don't need you to search for it. I already know they got the wrong nigga. So today we're going to show that every slave that ended up on a boat, transported someone else, and sent back to the Americas was not African.
Here are some results.
Again, Siri, Google, I don't need your results. We're going to go over a few Indian rebellions today. Namely, want to make sure we cover the Sapelo Revolt, because that's always noted as the first African resistance on American soil or whatever. So we want to make sure we go ahead and knock that out and show that it was Indians in these areas that were rebelling, that were not accepting this quote unquote slavery. And we also want to show how this quote unquote slavery was happening. Some of this stuff was not by gunpoint. Some of this stuff, which I'm going to show you the example of Francisco de Chicora, he got tricked, finessed, along with 60 to 80 other Indians, depending on who you ask. Taken to Spain, brought back to Carolina, and he went back home to his people. Let's get into it. The encomienda was a Spanish labor system that rewarded conquerors with the labor of particular groups of conquered non-Christian people. The laborers, in theory, were provided with benefits by the conquerors for whom they labored, the Catholic religion would be being the principal benefit. The encomienda was first established in Spain following the Christian conquest of Moorish territories, known as the Reconquista, and it was applied on a much larger scale during the Spanish colonization of the Americas. And it was applied on a much larger scale during the Spanish colonization of the Americas and the Spanish Philippines. Conquered people were considered vassals of the Spanish monarch. The crown awarded an encomienda as a grant to a particular individual. In the conquest era of the 16th century, the grants were considered to be a monopoly on the labor of particular groups of indigenous peoples, held in perpetuity by the grant holder, called the encomendero, and his or her descendants. In the encomienda, the Spanish crown granted a person a specified number of natives from a specific community, but did not dictate which individuals in the community would have to provide their labor. Indigenous leaders were charged with mobilizing the assessed tribute and labor. In turn, encomienderos were to ensure the encomienda natives were given instruction in the Christian faith and Spanish language. In turn, encomienderos were to ensure that the encomienda natives were given instruction in the Christian faith and Spanish language, and protect them from warring tribes or pirates. They had to suppress rebellion against Spaniards and maintain infrastructure. In return, the natives would provide tributes in the form of metals, maize, wheat, pork, or other agricultural products. So after Christopher Columbus, came to the Americas, adopted some of the Arawaks, taking them back to Spain 1, 2, 3 times, and all of this jazz. My question is, where are the Arawaks that he took to Spain? Where are all the Arawaks that Christopher Columbus took to Spain? But anyway, the Spanish crown sent a royal governor, Fray Nicolas de Ovando, who established the formal encomienda system. The Fray Nicolas de Ovando, who established the formal encomienda system. So we have established who started the formal encomienda system. It was Nicolas de Ovando. In many cases, natives were forced to do hard labor and subjected to extreme punishment and death if they resisted. However, Queen Isabella I of Castile forbade slavery of the native population and deemed the indigenous to be free vassals of the crown, which we know, they probably stopped enslaving for a little bit, then we're right back to it, but whatever. Various versions of the Law of the Indies from 1512 onwards attempt to regulate the interactions between settlers and natives. Both natives and Spaniards appealed to the real audiencias for relief under the encomienda system. So we see. Hello. All right. Yeah, just go and finish because I gotta finish this little video. All right. when your wife calls, you got to pick up. Now, oh, shit. So we've already established that Nicholas de Ovando established the encomienda system. And we know that the encomienda system granted a specific number of natives from a specified community, but did not dictate which individuals in the community would have to provide their labor. So now we see the switcheroo from the encomienda system as we go through the years of Charles V here. They replace it with a new system. So instead of encomienda, now the Spanish are using the repartimiento system as their labor workforce. The encomienda system was generally replaced by the crown-managed repartimiento system throughout Spanish America after the mid-16th century. Like the encomienda, the new repartimiento did not include the attribution of land to anyone, rather only the allotment of native workers, but they were directly allotted to the crown, who through a local crown official would assign them to work for settlers for a set period of time, usually several weeks. The repartimiento was an attempt to reduce the abuses of forced labor as the number of natives declined and mining activities were replaced by agricultural activities in the 17th century. The hacienda, or large landed estates in which laborers were directly employed by hacienda or owners, arose because land ownership became more profitable than acquisition of forced labor. So we see that the Spanish are using indigenous people as slaves in the 1500s, whether it's the encomienda system or the repartimiento system. They are still assigning natives into forced labor, and we can't forget that the encomienda system, the grants were considered to be a monopoly on the labor of particular groups of indigenous peoples held in perpetuity by the grant holder. So remember, encomienda allowed the indigenous people to be held in perpetuity. So Nicholas Ovando, the man who established this system of enslaving American Indians. Let's see what he has to say about some of the initial stages of the transatlantic slave trade. The early transatlantic slave trade, Nicholas Ovando. My man, let's see what's going on here. Nicholas Ovando was the first political leader to oversee the transatlantic slave trade to the Americas when he imported black slaves from Spain to the island of Hispaniola. He imported black slaves from Spain. Again, I'm going to ask where are those Arawaks that Christopher Columbus took to Spain, but we're going to continue. Ovando was the third governor of the Indies, as Spanish documents typically refer to Spain American colonies after Christopher Columbus and Francisco de Bobadilla, and assumed his post in 1502. The Catholic monarchs charged Ovando with indoctrinating Amerindians. The Catholic monarchs charged Ovando with indoctrinating Amerindians. Remember, he was teaching them the Catholic faith and Spanish, all right? Noting that as recent converts, they should not be allowed contact with Muslims, Jews, or Protestants. So the Moors that were being kicked out of Spain were not to be brought over to the Americas unless they were Moriscos. And they would have to be Catholic Moriscos. That's interesting, right? So the monarchs therefore banned North African Moor slaves from being transported into the New World, but allowed black slaves and other slaves who were born under Christian dominion, which would be all the American Indians at this point right now, or at least the American Indians that have already came in contact, with the Portuguese, with the Spanish. So let's keep on going. But they want to say it presumably means those born in Spain or Portugal. I mean, but if we say it's Christian dominion, that also applies to the Americas. While the original 1501 charter between the Spanish crown and Ovando left open the possibility that some slaves shipped across the Atlantic might not be of African descent, every subsequent letter exchanged between Ovando and Spain after 1502 referred to slaves exclusively as Negroes or blacks. Again, while the original 1501 charter between the Spanish crown and Ovando left open the possibility that some slaves shipped across the Atlantic might not be of African descent, every subsequent letter exchanged between Ovando and Spain after 1502 referred to slaves exclusively as Negroes or blacks. So they might not be of African descent, but they still Negroes and blacks. And we know in Nicholas Ovando Encomienda system, he is using natives as a part of his labor operation. Let's continue. Ovando at first resisted the transatlantic slave trade when the first slaves arrived in Hispaniola. Some quickly escaped into the mountains and began launching raids against Spanish settlements. In 1503, Ovando even petitioned the Spanish government to ban the transatlantic slave trade, arguing that if more black slaves escaped, they might incite the Amerindians into open revolt. And the governor had good reason to be concerned, as not long afterwards, the island saw a major indigenous uprising known as Enrico's Revolt. This revolt overlapped with a period of increasing African resistance and may have involved some collusion with enslaved Africans. Here go these words. May have. You just said it was an indigenous uprising. Now you just want to throw African in there just because. Like, it's weird reading this stuff sometimes. The governor changed his mind in 1505 and sent a request to King Fernando II for 17 slaves to be sent to the mines in Hispaniola. The king was even more ambitious than Ovando about using slave labor to increase gold production and sent 100 black slaves from Spain directly to the governor. 5 years later, the Negro slaves proved so effective that Ovando had 250 more slaves transported from Europe to work in the gold and copper mines. So, we're using Negroes and black. We're not using the word African. Ovando has already left it open that a lot of those slaves might not be of African descent, and his encomienda system or the repartimiento system is based upon indigenous labor. So let's continue. Aguebana, born Guebana and also known as Aguebana El Bravo. All right, just had to make sure that I didn't mute that joint. Aguebano, born Guebano, also known as Aguebano el Bravo, was one of the two principal and most powerful caciques of the Taino people in Borican when the Spaniards first arrived in Puerto Rico on November 19, 1493. Aguebano led the Tainos of Puerto Rico in the Battle of Yagucas, also known as Taino Rebellion of 1511, against Juan Ponce de Leon and the Spanish conquistador. Now, every time I write down Ponce de Leon, I curse his name. Aguebana, which has been interpreted by the 19th and 20th century authors as meaning the great son, was the hereditary title shared by the family that ruled the theocratic monarchy of Borican, governing the hierarchy over the rest of the regional chiefs or caciques. So, we know upon the senior's Aguebana's death in 1510, his brother Guebana, better known as Aguebana II, became the most powerful cacique in the entire island, Puerto Rico. Aguebana had his doubts about the godly status of the Spaniards. He came up with a plan to test the perceived godly nature of the Spanish. He and Urayon, sorry, I'm butchering all these Spanish names, cacique of Anasco sent some of their tribe members to lure a Spaniard by the name of Diego Salcedo into a river and drown him. They washed over Salcedo's body to make sure that he would not resuscitate. Salcedo's death was enough to convince him and the rest of the Taino people that the Spaniards were not gods. Aguebano held war dances or secret meetings with other caciques where he organized a revolt against the Spaniards. Cristobal de Sotomayor sent the spy Juan Gonzalez to one of the Arritos where he learned of Aguebana's plans. Interesting, this dude named is Sotomayor, and Tommy Sotomayor be doing all that junky shit he be doing. But anyway, in spite of the warning, Aguebana killed Sotomayor and his men and gravely wounded Gonzalez. Juan Gonzalez escaped, making his way to Capara, where he reported the killings to Ponce de Leon. Meanwhile, Guarionex, cacique of the Utado, attacked the village of Sotomayor and killed 80 of his inhabitants. After this, Ponce de Leon led the Spaniards in a series of offensives against the Taínos that culminated in the Battle of Yucacas. So in 1511, in the region known as Yucacas, I know I'm butchering this stuff, right? Some 11,000 to 15,000 Taínos had assembled against some 80 to 100 Spaniards. 11 to 15,000 Taínos had assembled against some 80 to 100 Spaniards. Before the start of the battle, a Spanish soldier used an arquebus shot and killed a native. It is presumed this was Aguebana II because the warrior was wearing a golden necklace, which only a cacique wore. After the death of Aguebana II, the native warriors retracted and became disorganized. Aguebana's followers opted for engaging the Spaniards via guerrilla tactics. Isn't that what the Gullah was known for? Those guerrilla tactics. But anyway, let's keep going. Such guerrilla warfare rebellion lasted for the next 8 years until 1519. A second round of raids erupted in 1513 when Ponce de Leon departed the island to explore Florida. The settlement of Capara, the seat of the island government at that time, was sacked and burned by an alliance between Taínos and natives from the northeastern Antilles. So, at this point, we see that American Indians are still being used for forced labor, and we're talking about 1510, 1511, you're already seeing rebellions of the indigenous populations rejecting this encomienda system that's in play. So you can see how they end up developing that repartimiento system in 1542 if all of this bucking is going on, if you will. So let's continue to talk about all of these Indians in their rebellion, shall we? Enrico, also known as Enrique by the Spaniards, was a Taino cacique who rebelled against the Spaniards between 1519 and 1533. Enrique's rebellion is the best known rebellion of the early Caribbean period. He was born on the shores of Lake Jaragua and was part of the royal family of Jaragua. His aunt Anacona was a queen of the Jaragua, and his father Majucatex was the crown prince. He is considered a hero in modern-day Dominican Republic and Haiti for his resistance in favor of the indigenous people. Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, who documented and rallied against Spanish abuses of the native peoples, wrote sympathetically of Enrique. So here we go again. Now we switched from Puerto Rico to Dominican Republic and Haiti, and we still have these resistances going on to these slave systems that the Spanish are trying to implement. So we see that several revolts followed in the first half of the 16th century. The most famous began in 1519. Enrique, one of the few remaining caciques or indigenous chiefs, started the revolt with a large number of Tainos from the mountain range of Bajaruco. The Tainos were able to continue the rebellion because of their better knowledge of fighting and the method that he applied of irregular warfare, sounds like them guerrilla tactics again, and his cunning, patience, and prudence. The efficient information and supply service that he organized in the region and the high mountains of the Sierra made him feared by the Spaniards. A true military leader, a great captain capable of facing and defeating the representative of the most powerful nation in the world at that time. Their resistance forced the King of Spain to commission Francisco de Bernabo to put an end by means of negotiation or force to the long conflict that unsettled the colony. So we see another uprising led by indigenous people, and this is in Haiti from 1519 to 1533. And this is important because in history, they're going to try to tell you that the first African slaves were brought here by Lucas, as far as the Carolina regions, were brought by Lucas Vasquez del Ayllon. They're going to tell you he brought African slaves, sent them to Hispaniola, brought them up here. But no. We know that didn't happen because we're looking at an indigenous uprising going on in 1519 to 1533. You know all this cracking on in this area in Haiti. You're going to get slaves to take them down there. You finna go put yourself in that mess, in that massacre. That's what you're about to go do that? I don't really think so. I don't think so. It's more than likely any indigenous people or quote unquote slave that you get or that are operating on this side of the world at this point in time are clearly from the Americas. As again, we state the repartimiento and the encomienda system are based on the labor of indigenous people when we are talking about Spanish. So let's keep going. Let's get into the Spanish and Taino War, right? I think I just went over that a bit. There's really no need to get deep into it for real. I think it was just... yeah, really no need to go over this. We just went over that in 1511 here. But we need to check out your man Juan Ponce de Leon and what he had going on, because he's the one that's generally credited as being the first European to discover Florida, right? And we know that that famous black man Juan Garrido was with Juan Ponce de Leon. We get that. Um, yeah, for what I'm saying, one could have been melanated in all honesty. And just from me looking at all these Spanish conquistadors coming over here. So again, Juan Ponce de Leon is generally credited as being the first European to discover Florida. However, that may not have been the case. Spanish raiders from the Caribbean may have conducted small secret raids in Florida to capture and enslave native Floridians at some time between 1500 and 1510. Well, look at that. Look at that. Weren't we just looking at a slave rebellion that was occurring right around this time in Puerto Rico? Seems like everybody is fighting everywhere. So let's continue. In 1512, Juan Ponce de Leon, governor of Puerto Rico, received royal permission to search for land north of Cuba. On March 3rd, 1513, his expedition departed from Punta Aguada, Puerto Rico, sailing north in 3 ships. In late March, he spotted a small island, almost certainly one of the Bahamas, but did not land. On April 2nd, Ponce de Leon spotted the east coast of the Florida Peninsula and went ashore the next day at an exact location that has been lost to time. Assuming that he had found a large island, he claimed the land for Spain and named it La Florida because it was the season of Pascu, Florida, flowery Easter, and because much of the vegetation was in bloom. After briefly exploring the area around the landing site, the expedition returned to their ships and sailed south to map the coast, encountering the Gulf Stream along the way. The expedition followed Florida's coastline all around the Florida Keys and north to map a portion of southwest Florida coast before returning to Puerto Rico. So, Ponce de Leon did not have substantial documented interaction with Native Americans during his voyage. However, the people he met, likely the Temecula, Tequesta, and Calusa, were mostly hostile at first contact and knew a few Castilian words, lending credence to the idea that it had already been visited by Spanish raiders. Popular legend has it that Ponce de Leon was searching for the Fountain of Youth when he discovered Florida. Shout out to my boy Tejo. However, the first mention of Ponce de Leon allegedly searching for water to cure his aging, he was only 40, came after his death, more than the 20 years after his voyage of discovery. And the first that placed the Fountain of Youth in Florida was 30 years after that. It is much more likely that Ponce de Leon, like other Spanish conquistadors in the Americas, was looking for gold, land to colonize and rule for Spain, and Indians to convert to Christianity or enslave. So again, even with Ponce de Leon, we're talking about enslaving Indians again. So other Spanish voyages to Florida quickly followed Ponce de Leon's return. Sometime from 1514 to 1516, Pedro de Salazar led an officially sanctioned raid which enslaved as many as 500 Indians along the Atlantic coast of present-day southeastern United States. Diego Marula mapped what was probably Tampa Bay in 1516. Francisco Hernandez de Cordova mapped most of Florida's Gulf Coast to the Mississippi River in 1517, and Alonso Alvarez de Pineda sailed and mapped the central and western Gulf to the Yucatan Peninsula in 1519. So as we continue to review, we've walked through a rebellion in Puerto Rico, a rebellion in Haiti. We see that the Florida Indians are quite hostile because obviously they've already been raided as well, right? So let's keep on going as we see the Spanish start to map out our areas here. So in 1521, Ponce de Leon sailed from Cuba with 200 men and 2 ships to establish a colony on the southwest coast of Florida Peninsula, probably near Charlotte Harbor. However, attacks by the native Calusa drove the colonists away in July 1521. After the skirmish, Ponce de Leon was wounded as he had an arrow sticking out his thigh However, that was not the only injury he had during the battle. Ponce de Leon died of his injury upon the expedition's return to Havana. I think Juan Garrido was able to get out of that though and continue to live and go on some more missions with the Spanish and whatnot and do his thing. But I keep mentioning Juan Garrido because I really I just want some proof that he's African. Like I see that he was been recognized as being in Lisbon since 7, and I know the Congo had a relationship with the Portuguese at this point in time, but without accurate information on his parents, because it seems nobody can tell us who his parents are. I can't really make a full determination of who Juan Garrido is, but without a doubt, he was a black conquistador. All right, so let's keep on going. We're going to talk about Pedro de Quejo. Here's the man I want to talk about because he get me into this, what we really want to get into today, which is the Sapelo Revolt. In 1521, Pedro de Quejo and Francisco Gordillo enslaved 60 Indians at Winyah Bay, South Carolina. Quejo, with the backing of Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon, returned to the region in 1525, stopping at several locations between Amelia Island and Chesapeake Bay. In 1526, de Ayllon led an expedition of some 600 people to the South Carolina coast. After scouting possible locations as far south as Ponce de Leon Inlet in Florida, the settlement of San Miguel de Guadalupe was established in the vicinity of Sapelo Sound, Georgia. Disease, hunger, cold, and Indian attacks. Disease, hunger, cold, and Indian attacks led to San Miguel being abandoned after only 2 months. There's no African mentioned nowhere in the story concerning the revolt that happened at San Miguel de Guadalupe. They claim it was disease, hunger, cold, and Indian attacks that led to the mission being abandoned. About 150 survivors of the original 600 survived and returned to Spanish settlements. So, let's talk about some of these Indians that were enslaved at Winyah Bay, South Carolina. And what happened with some of these Indians, right? Here we go. The mission, San Miguel de Guadalupe, was founded in 1526 by Spanish colonizer Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon. It was the first European settlement in what became the continental United States, and the third in North America north of Mexico. It's interesting, right? De Ayllon established his first colony at Winyah Bay for a month, then moved to the coast of Georgia, where the colony lasted 2 months before it was overwhelmed by disease, hunger, a slave uprising, and a Native American population that responded in a hostile manner to the invading colonizers, whose earlier scouts had enslaved hundreds of Native Americans and had taken them to Santo Domingo. So this is even more than the 60 to 80 we just read, right? They say that his scouts enslaved hundreds of Native Americans and taken them to Santo Domingo. Of the 600 persons that established this colony with Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon, again, only 150 returned home alive. Sound like the Indians were really, really bugging on this end, buddy. So let's keep going. Let's keep going. The enslaved Africans brought by the settlers became the first documented instance of black slavery in mainland North America and carried out the first slave rebellion there. Where did Africans come from? Because you done enslaved hundreds of Native Americans here, and you enslaved 60 Native Americans here, right? That's what you say, according to your records. But we consistently see after you left in 1521, right, and came back in 1526, right? What did you do with the Indian slaves that you had to now just throw this word in here, the enslaved Africans? It just doesn't belong, right? Let me show you why it doesn't belong. Because the man who owns the slaves, Lucas Vasquez de Leon, let's check out his activity in the slave market. He was a wealthy sugar planter on Hispaniola. We're going to talk about Dominican Republic, Haiti, whichever one you want to call it, right? And magistrate of a colonial royal appeals court, the Real Audiencia. In 1521, he dispatched Francisco Gordillo on an expedition to the Bahamas to kidnap people with slaves. Finding the islands completely depopulated, sure was a damn lie, Gordillo and another slaving ship piloted by Pedro de Quejo sailed northwest in search of a land that a previous slaving expedition had found in that direction. Remember, we were just talking about the Florida Indians being raided between 1500 to 1510. On June 24, 1521, they made a landfall at Winyah Bay on the coast of present-day South Carolina. At some preliminary exploration of the region, they kidnapped 70 Indians and brought them back to the Hispaniola. So it's obviously they don't know how many Indians. They might have kidnapped hundreds of Indians, or they might have kidnapped 70. They don't know, but it was a bunch, obviously. So, and when they mean kidnap, we're going to read the primary source for Francisco de Chicora a little later, showing how this little event took place. But let's keep going here. The authorities in Hispaniola criticized this capture, but did not send them back because of the expense. No penalties were imposed on the captors. The captors scavenged dead animals in the town. Most died, and the others were then divided among the inhabitants. Like, they just make up ignorant ass lies that don't even. These people been farming their whole lives. Now they scavenging dead animals. That's what you want us to believe. Time for this ignorance, right? When they returned to Hispaniola, Gordillo and Quejo brought back glowing reports of the land they had found. They said it would not require military conquest, and once settled, the area would become a rich and prosperous colony. Allen was apparently inspired by these reports and soon wrote to the Spanish crown requesting permission to explore and settle the region. Later that same year, he traveled to Spain on business for the Audiencia, but also used the opportunity to personally press his case for the new land. Allen took with him one of the captured Indians who had recently been baptized as Francisco de Chicora and later served as a translator for the Spanish. Chicora was the Spanish name for Francisco's homeland, Chicori or Wacoma. I'm part Wacoma. Shout out to the Cofields. Love my blood. So let's keep going. One of the several Siouan-speaking territories in the region subject to a chief Data Oduhi. In Spain, they met the court chronicler Peter Martyr, with whom Francisco spoke at length about his people and homeland and about neighboring provinces. Francisco described the people of Duaje as white and having blonde hair to the heels, and told of a gigantic Indian king called Datha who ruled a race of giants. He also recounted the story of a former race of men who grew long tails and only ate a specific type of fish. Perhaps most interesting to the Spanish, he assured his audience that the pearls and other valuable gems could be found in the region. On June 12, 1523, Allen obtained a cedula, or royal patent, from Charles IV and the Council of the Indies, allowing him to establish a settlement on the eastern seaboard and conduct trades with the local natives. He would be governor for life, and the title mayor or high sheriff would be held by him and his heirs forever. In return for these and numerous other privileges, Allen was required to perform a more detailed exploration of the region, establish missions, church, and a Franciscan monastery to further conversion of the native population, and he was restrained from implementing an encomienda or other means of forcing Indian labor. As required by his contract, Allen hired Cahill to lead an exploratory voyage consisting of the two caravels, about 60 crewmen. They set sail in April 1525 with instructions to explore 200 leagues to 640 nautical miles of coastline, record necessary bearings and signers, erect stone markers bearing the name of Charles V, and obtain Indians who might serve as guides and interpreters for future voyages. They made their last landfall on May 3rd, 1525, likely at the Savannah River. From there, they continued north until reaching Winya Bay, the site of the original landing in 1521. It is not clear how much further north Cahill traveled, possibly as far as Chesapeake Bay, but he observed that the coast beyond Winya Bay was mostly sand dunes and pine scrub. The expedition returned home in July 1525. So let's talk about this settlement and failure of this colony. Cahill's return marked the beginning of active preparation for a voyage of settlement led by Allen himself. He spent his considerable fortune and even put himself into debt to outfit the expedition. A fleet consisting of 6 vessels carrying about 600 to 700 passengers and crew was assembled. Some men, women, children, and enslaved Africans were included amongst the settlers. Again, where did the Indians go? 2 Dominican friars, Antonio de Montesinos and Antonio de Cervantes, were brought along to minister to both the settlers and the natives. Montesinos was well known in Hispaniola for his outspoken opposition to enslavement and mistreatment of the Indians. Supplies and livestock, including cows, sheep, pigs, and 100 horses, were loaded, and the fleet departed in mid-July 1526. The large colonizing group landed in Winya Bay on August 9, 1526, and encountered their first significant setback when their flagship, the Capitina, struck a sandbar and sank. There was no loss of life, but a large portion of their supplies was lost. In addition, Francisco de Jocora and the other Indians brought along as interpreters and guides. You see this? You just said won't nobody up here with some women, children, and enslaved Africans. Then in the very next sentence, you are acknowledging how Francisco de Jocora and the other Indians were brought along as interpreters and guides. They deserted the fleet in the first few days and escaped into the woods. Say this again. Francisco de Jocora and the other Indians that were brought along as interpreters and guides deserted the fleet of the Spanish in the first few days and escaped into the woods. Sound like that Maroon action we'll be hearing so much about. And we keep following these Indian rebellions. It's sounding more and more like these Maroon actions. Every time we hear them, we got these Indians running into the mountains, running into the swamps, running into the woods, practicing guerrilla warfare. So let's keep it pushing, right? Let's see. On September 29, 1526, the settlement was christened San Miguel de Guadalupe in observance of the feast of Saint Michael the Archangel. Archangel. Guadalupe was likely a reference to the local Guale tribe, a chiefdom that was part of the Mississippian culture. The colony situation, already hampered by a late start and loss of their flagship, quickly became worse. The settlers suffered from hunger, cold, disease, and hostile natives. Here we go again with these hostile natives. It was too late in the season to plant crops, and game was scarce. The surrounding waters were teeming with fish, but the settlers were too sick or otherwise unwilling to catch fish. The shallow water table and poor soil would have made it easy to contaminate their wells with humans and animal waste. Disease was rampant, especially dysentery or other waterborne illnesses. Allen had hoped to supplement their food stores by trading with the Indians. So they needed us for food after all that crap. However, the natives were unable or unwilling to provide assistance. I bet. On top of everything, the weather turned unseasonably cold, increasing the settlers' misery and discontent. The death toll climbed quickly, and on October 18, 1526, Allen himself died. Captain Francisco Gomez became leader of the colony. He and the other council members wanted to stay and wait for resupply from Hispaniola, another faction led by Ginés Donsal and his lieutenant. Pedro de Bazan pushed for withdrawal. Within a week of Allen's death, Donsal and a group of armed supporters arrested Gomez and the other leaders and locked them in Donsal's house. At the same time, another group of settlers forced themselves on a local Indian village, demanding food and other assistance. The village resistance and the settlers were killed. This incident marked a turning point for the local Indians and incited further hostilities against the Spaniards. Donsal was determined to eliminate those who opposed him. One night, he and Bazan set out to ambush and kill two of their most vocal opponents. For reasons that are unclear, some of the enslaved Africans set fires to Donsal's house that same night. See, again, where these enslaved Africans come from. Where these Africans come from? Because we're still using the encomienda system right now. It's still based on the labor of indigenous people, as we have not even gotten to 1542 in the repartimiento laws, which still used indigenous labor. So let's continue. Captain Francisco Gomez became the leader of the colony, blah, blah, blah. All right, Donsal was determined to eliminate those who still opposed him. One night, he and Bazan set out to ambush and kill two of their most vocal opponents for reasons that are unclear. Some of the enslaved Africans, which we know they're not enslaved Africans, those are enslaved Indians, set fires to Donsal's house that same night. In the ensuing confusion, Gomez and the other city leaders were freed. Bazan was totally wounded or fatally wounded, and Donsal and the other mutineers were arrested. By then, the surviving colonists agreed it was time to evacuate the colonists and return to Hispaniola. So now they're like, it's time to get the fuck out here. They're not going to stop. By the end of October, they were boarding their ships, and by mid-November, all the settlers had left San Miguel de Guadalupe. But listen to this shit, though, right? Because they just can't give the Indians credit for defending our natural habitat. Since the early 21st century, some American scholars believe that Allen probably developed the 1526 settlement at or near present-day Georgia Sapelo Island. They believe the scholarly speculation suggesting that the San Miguel settlement, Tierra de Allen, was founded any further to the north cannot be substantiated. Archaeological attempts to locate the site have been so far unsuccessful. Peck believes it was at the mouth of the Savannah River, which would have been hard for the land party to cross in reaching Sapelo. So again, We're talking about these 600 settlers that came with them and an unknown number of enslaved Africans, just like this unknown number of American Indians. You got Captain Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón, who had his slaves captured by Francisco Gordillo and Pedro de Queso, right? Just a little background on those guys. Francisco Gordillo was a captain, most likely in the Spanish Navy of the early 1520s, and he reported to Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón, of course. And Pedro was more simply known as a Spanish slaver, apparently a hired gun, who plied the Caribbean and Atlantic Ocean, plundering small islands and capturing native Indians for slavery to help the Spanish in their search for gold in the Americas. In 1521, de Ayllón sent Francisco Gordillo to explore northward from Hispaniola. Along the way, Captain Gordillo met with Pedro de Queso, a Spanish slaver, and the two of them are the first known Spaniards to sail along the Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia coast. Many rivers, bays, capes, and other geographical features were named by Captain Gordillo during this exploration, which was fairly well documented with sketches and maps that served the map makers well into the 1500s. Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón, a judge of the court on Hispaniola, sent an expedition to search the Bahamas for Indians to be sold as slaves. If that failed, the slavers were supposed to go back to the coastal area that Salazar had called the Land of Giants. Vasquez de Ayllón gave this task to Francisco Gordillo, who departed Hispaniola in early 1521. He sailed to the Bahamas but found no natives. I'm sure that's a lie. Previous slave hunters and visited these islands on numerous occasions and had captured so many people that only a handful remained. Gordillo unexpectedly met another slave raider, Pedro de Queso. The two joined forces at Angel Island, sailed north and west. After about 10 days, they finally landed near the mouth of the Santee River in what is present-day South Carolina. Among the 60 or more Indians kidnapped by Gordillo and Quejo from the area was a young boy who named El Chicorano or Francisco Chicora. Francisco was a marvelous storyteller, and after his arrival in Hispaniola, he entertained Vasquez de Ayllón and his friends with his tales. Ayllón later took Francisco to Spain, where he continued to his storyteller. Although Ayllón had plans to return some natives to their homeland, most of them died not long after reaching Hispaniola. Again, another story of the Indians just dying for no reason, just dead, right? So you don't have to tell the truth about you bringing Indian slaves back to the Carolinas and them going back to their peoples and rebelling against your nonsense. So far, we went through the encomienda. We went through Nicholas Ovando using the Indian slaves and also indicating that some slaves shipped across the Atlantic might not be of African descent. Now, I've got first-hand research here, a letter that he wrote to the Spanish monarchy. We went over the Puerto Rican rebellion, the one happened in 1510. Interesting that this occurred right after the Florida Indians had already been raided and had some Indians taken. I find that quite interesting. After that, we're going to look at the Dominican Republic and Haiti, that rebellion that was led by the Taino chief, again, practicing that guerrilla warfare, shocking the Spanish. All right, here. So we went over Juan Ponce de Leon and his failed settlement, right? Talked a little bit about Juan Garrido and his travels with Juan Ponce de Leon. We went over Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón and the settlement of San Miguel de Guadalupe. His enslavement of Francisco de Chicora, taking him and other Indians back to Spain and later returning to the coast of South Carolina, allowing these Indians to escape and go back to their homelands. Now, just another history of when you bay that you see, they always try to just roll this African term into history where it doesn't belong. We know where Lucas Vasquez de Leon got his Indian slaves from. We know his Indian slaves traveled with him to Spain, and we know his Indian slaves traveled with him back to Carolina. So this Sapelo revolt, that Sapelo revolt that they always try to give credit to, and as this first African resistance up here in mainland North America, I'm gonna have to give that to the Indians, yo. I'm gonna have to give that to the Indians. Y'all can't have the Sapelo revolt. You can't have it. As I go through this history, more and more, it is easy to see the bullshit. And if anybody is saying that Lucas did not have Indian slaves, prove it. You were to say Indian slaves did not travel to Spain with Lucas, prove it. You want to say the Indians did not travel back to the Carolinas after being in Spain with Lucas Vasquez de Leon and revolted, prove it. I'll be waiting. I could really get into that bag, get to talking about the Juanillos revolts, going into the Guale Indians and the merger with the Yamasee and all of that, but really ain't even necessary for real. I'll go over Juanillos because we already here, right? Juanillo was the chief of a Native American Tolomato people in the Guale chiefdom in what is now Georgia. In September 1597, Juanillo led the so-called Gualean Revolt, or Juanillos Revolt, against the cultural oppression of the indigenous population in Florida by the Spanish authorities and the Franciscan missionaries. This was the first and longest-lasting Guale rebellion in La Florida, and ended with the execution of Juanillo by a group of Native American allies of the Spanish, led by Chief Aso. They can never do it without us. And there was never no Indian. It was never no Europeans tracking no Indians. You know what I mean? So it is what it is on that, you know. Juanillo was Miko, or chieftain of the Tolomato and heir to the chiefdom of Guale. After the arrival of the Spanish colonizers in Florida, some chiefs of the Guale tribe, whose vast territory stretched from the Altamaha River to what is now Port Royal, were concerned about the spread of Christianity. Their grievances under the administration of the Spanish governor Gonzalo Mendez de Caso included Franciscan missionaries forbidding Indian practices of polygamy, divorce, dancing, games, and tribal wars. Yeah, them Batarantes definitely took advantage of our polygamy system down there in South America once they were able to marry in. These proscriptions weakened his people, according to Juanillo, making them lose their courage and skill. Juanillo's hatred of the Spanish missionaries was so intense that on the morning of September 13, 1597, his warriors killed the Franciscan friar Corpa at the Tolomato mission. Juanillo's men beheaded Corpa and placed his head on a spike. The next day, Juanillo called on the chiefs of the other Native American groups who were being expelled from their lands by the Spanish and incited them to kill missionaries living in the region. The rebellion spread throughout the province of Guale, or Gual, with most of the missions there attacked by the Indians and 5 Franciscans killed. News of the rebellion reached St. Augustine in early October. DeConco, who was sick in bed, got up and organized a relief expedition that he led himself. The Indians in Guale were burning churches and maiming and killing missionaries, unable to catch the Indian rebels. DeConco had to content himself with burning their villages and destroying their crops. He took one prisoner who told him about the death of the friar. In May 1598, DeConco rescued the only missionary survivor of the Juanillo massacre, Friar Francisco de Villa, who had been enslaved by the Indians in the town of Tulufina, not far from the Tolomato. DeConco's troops suppressed the rebellion, which ended decisively when the expedition of Indian allies of the Spanish, led by the Mico chief of Aso, attacked Juanillo's stronghold in the stockaded town of Fusanico. Can't pronounce that. Fusanic, killing him with 24 of his main supporters. Their deaths brought a temporary peace to Florida. After a revolt, May 1600, a delegation of Guale chiefs went to St. Augustine to swear obedience to King Philip III in the presence of Governor de Conco. He accepted their submission on certain conditions. Above all, they must suppress any uprisings against the Spanish. Other sources, however, indicate that the rebellion was actually suppressed by his successor, Pedro de Ibarra, who treated the indigenous people with kindness. His approach was successful in brokering the peace essential to the colony's development. In 1603, De Conco visited Guale territory to assess the loyalty of the Indians and to receive new oaths of allegiance from them. I mean, y'all gonna have to tell me how they went extinct. Now, we can see how the Guale assimilated, or the Guale assimilated into other groups, other Indian groups in the South. It never went extinct. It just, some stayed where they were, and some moved down into Florida, some went more inland into Georgia. Anyway, I can check all that out. Man, somebody show me the Africans. Show me the Africans in the Sapelo Revolt. Show me the Africans in the rebellion with Enrique. Show me the Africans in the Taino Rebellion of 1511. Where are the Africans who were rebellion? What were their names? Where was the culture? Please show me. How were they captured? When were they captured? Please show me. Until next time, I gotta get back to these jits. They wildin'. Y'all be safe.